Thank you very much, Ingrid. It's a really great pleasure to be here and a great honour to speak at this prestigious event. And I'd like to thank Joe Mulholland and wish him all the best for inviting me here. It's also a great honour to be here in such a beautiful place. It's a particular honour to be speaking to you who are all inside when it's sunny outside. So I hope we and the panel can make it worthwhile for you to be here. Although I was worried when Ingrid, you mentioned the emergency exits, that when I mentioned sunshine, people might actually leave. So try not to leave too early in that case. So yes, I'd like to thank Joe and the organisers for inviting me. As chair of the National Competitiveness Council, my real interest and focus has to be on the ability of the enterprise base in Ireland to compete in international markets. And why is that important? Well, Ireland's ability to compete, to sell our goods and services abroad is the key determinant of economic growth. It's the key determinant of our ability to provide jobs and sustainable jobs. It's the key factor that will determine how much we can pay ourselves, what wages we can pay ourselves. But importantly, it's also the key thing that will ensure that we can pay for quality public services. So maintaining our competitiveness is the only way to ensure our economic recovery is sustainable, and that perhaps for the first time we avoid the boom and bust cycles to which Ireland is so prone. So Ireland's experienced a rapid and remarkable recovery. Both GDP and our GNP, or income per capita, have already moved above the pre-crisis levels. The National Competitiveness Council's Competitiveness Scorecard report, which we launched this week, benchmarks Ireland's performance across a range of indicators, such as employment growth, productivity, exports, public finances, and they all show that our relative performance is very good and that those things are strong. However, my concern is that the composition of the economy, particularly our export base, is overstating Ireland's overall performance and masking weaknesses in the underlying drivers of future competitive performance, particularly with regard to infrastructure and productivity, if you like, the value of what each of us produces every hour that we work. Ireland's national accounts data now include a very significant amount of activity carried out elsewhere, but formally recorded as part of Irish national income, Irish GDP and GNP. Metrics from these measures, such as the various fiscal ratios to GDP, debt ratios, measures of potential output gap, all of these things that are used to assess the performance of the economy at the top level, at the macro level, can be misleading. So the Council, it's worth acknowledging the work of the CSO in producing a modified gross national income indicator, which provides an alternative view of the underlying state of the economy. The new indicator appropriately adjusts for what are called retained earnings of redomiciled firms and depreciation on foreign-owned domestic capital assets. So essentially, these activities for multinationals here, that it's questionable as to exactly what the contribution they make to the economy are. So following the launch of what is known as GNI Star, and I think Stephen will talk more about this, the National Income and Expenditure annual results published last week report a 30% difference between GDP, which is the traditional measure we use, and this new measure that takes out some of the activities of the multinationals. So that's a big difference in terms of economic performance if you use the two different measures. But it is important to say that GDP is still an accurate measure and is still the appropriate measure in regard to several metrics. But given the highly complex and globalised nature of the Irish economy, it's really important that this new measure is a sort of supplementary one that perhaps gives us a reality check of exactly how strong the economy really is underneath it all, or how vulnerable we are to some of the activities of the multinational sector. So the overall outlook, though, and I want to be very positive at the outset, the overall economic outlook for Ireland is very positive. We should not forget easily how we longed to be in this position in 2008, 9 and 10. And certainly, yes, you're right, when I was working in government buildings during those years, that's when I had hair before those 3 years started. We all really wish to be in this position. And we also should not forget how many said we wouldn't be in this positive position at this time, and that we should undertake much more dramatic moves back then, perhaps to devalue or leave the euro area, or a lot of some of the crazy propositions put around at that time. However, along with the good news that we face now, the economy faces significant threats from external factors beyond our control. Taxation policy in the US, potential shift in trade and taxation policy under Trump, and of course, the outcome of the Brexit negotiations will be critical. So those are external threats, and so that makes it even more crucial that we control those things that we have within our control. It's the only way we insulate ourselves from these external factors. And what we're seeing now is significant price pressures in property, labour, business service costs, and the public faces very high prices for consumer goods in Ireland. We're also seeing hidden inflation in the economy, by which we mean where the prices mightn't rise, but we get congestion, so increased traffic congestion. In Dublin now, the taxi shortages are starting to emerge at key times of the day, which is really an astonishing development and demonstration of how quickly the Dublin economy has recovered, and public transport's becoming busier. So Ireland's response to the economic crisis at the time was exceptional political bravery and remarkable policy consistency across three governments of different political colours. There was a relentless focus on bringing our macroeconomic variables back into line: debt, GDP, the government deficit, stabilising the banking system. The same relentless focus now needs to be placed on retaining the competitiveness of the economy. So I welcome, therefore, the Taoiseach's positioning of competitiveness as a key pillar of the Brexit response. We must maintain Ireland's cost competitiveness and invest in supporting infrastructure and talent. In that context, the decisions made today regarding the use of what is called fiscal space will determine the competitiveness of the economy in the future, so how sustainable our recovery actually is. So ensuring the state's finances are prudently managed is a critical element in providing a stable business environment in which enterprise can thrive. The government can't provide services efficiently if it has to make high interest payments on its past debts. Running fiscal deficits limits the government's future ability to react to business cycles. Firms cannot operate efficiently when inflation rates are out of hand. In some, and as we know from painful experience in the lead up to the crisis, the economy cannot grow in a sustainable manner unless the macro environment is stable. From the competitiveness perspective, fiscal governance and discussions relating to what has been termed fiscal space should adhere, in my view, to three main objectives. The first, attaining sound budgetary positions. Secondly, reducing the cyclical nature of fiscal policy making. And three, improving the efficiency of public spending. So on taking the first element, stable and sustainable public finances are a prerequisite for competitiveness. This requires an appropriate balancing of the needs to meet our obligations under the European Stability and Growth Pact and put in place a sustainable, counter-cyclical, medium-term fiscal planning process, by which we mean that we can react in bad times and put money in, and in good times we're able to save some money. So we have to balance that with the need to increase capital investment to enhance competitiveness and support enterprise. So investments in infrastructure, education, those types of things that will enhance our competitiveness in the future. So based on our current trajectory, Ireland's on track to reach the target of a structural balance of 0.5% of GDP in 2018. So economic growth has also contributed to improvements in our debt to GDP ratio. In order to withstand Brexit-related shocks, the Department of Finance had set an additional midterm goal of bringing the debt to GDP ratio down to 45%, which is below what was required by Europe. This target has now been amended to 55% by the government to allow for increasing expenditure on capital. And we on the Council recognise the budgetary challenges of reducing the deficit level while at the same time ensuring that fiscal policy supports sustainable economic and employment growth and facilitates sufficient public investment in projects that enhance our productivity, our ability to produce higher value per hour, which then sustains our jobs and our wage rates. But that will require some really difficult decisions, in some cases foregoing immediate but temporary gains so that we can provide for the future. We invest in our future when times are better. Taking a longer term view is often politically unpalatable, particularly in the current volatile environment. But if we are to avoid the Irish cycle of boom and bust, we must look at the medium term and not just the short term. On the second aspect of fiscal policy, reducing the cyclical nature of fiscal policy making is a challenge across the EU, but it's a particular challenge for Ireland. where GDP growth rates are less stable, they've been up and down, and as one of the most globalized economies, our domestic economy is too small to insulate ourselves against what happens in the world economy. We're like a cork on the ocean, it's been said. In Ireland, the Fiscal Responsibility Act legislated for the implementation of the national and EU fiscal rules, essentially to keep us in check. And by Europe, Ireland's expected to meet what's called its medium-term objective. There's lots of European jargon in this, by adjusting essentially its structural budgetary position, so the government's, if you like, purse, by at least 0.5% of GDP annually. And the medium-term objective for Ireland is a balanced budget in structural terms, and the expenditure benchmark requires the government expenditure to grow at or below the country's medium-term potential economic growth rate, depending on the country's position with respect to the NTO. Now, why did I read you all of those words? I think it's really important at this stage and at this point to say that it's my personal view that the term fiscal space presents a significant danger. It gives a sense that there's some highly convincing science behind determining such things as structural and cyclical deficits. So what is an ongoing problem, which is the structural deficit, and what is just because we're in a different point in the business cycle? There is no exact science behind that. It also suggests we can accurately predict economic growth. We only need to look back a few years to realise that we simply can't be sure what the levels of the indicators will or should be in the economy. For example, if the world economy continues to grow, if Brexit exposure is not too damaging to the macroeconomy, and if growth rates continue without a sharp loss of competitiveness, our capital investment is way too low to ensure that we don't lose that competitiveness. But if the fragile world economy stutters, if Brexit's very damaging to the Irish economy, if foreign direct investment flows to Ireland reduce substantially, we can very quickly revert to an unsustainable fiscal position. Remember the extreme capital investment we had in the run-up to the crisis, record levels, people saying, oh, it's crazy to have this Terminal 2 in the airport, it's crazy to have these roads, and yet we're now finding we're seeing congestion already. So it's very difficult to predict. So we can very quickly revert to an unsustainable fiscal position if our projections are not correct. In regard to the revenue side, tax policy is a key tool and a major determinant of the competitiveness of the environment for enterprise. The tax system put in place at the time of the crisis, amongst other contributory factors in the run-up to the crisis, made our ability to withstand the crisis without external support impossible. So we had to have help. So tax reforms have contributed to Ireland's recent fiscal adjustment, but there is further scope to improve the efficiency of the tax system. Another concern I have about the two-speed nature of the economy is that developments in the national account show the potential volatility or unsustainable nature of some of the rapidly growing sources of recent revenues into the Exchequer, such as the increase in corporation tax receipts by almost 50% in year-on-year terms in 2015. Past experience highlights the danger of relying on volatile and potentially transitory revenue sources to fund increased levels of public spending or reductions in tax rates, which can prove hard to reverse. The Department of Finance has recently indicated that the top 20 multinational companies in Ireland paid 50% of the corporation tax rate received in 2016. Our exposure to a concentrated level of corporation tax receipts among a very small cohort of firms remains a huge risk to the sustainability of the public finances. So maintaining a growth and entrepreneurship-friendly taxation system while simultaneously broadening the tax base is critical to maintaining existing levels of employment and creating new jobs. Efforts to secure the tax base should reflect the OECD tax hierarchy for growth, which outlines the taxes on immobile bases such as property and consumption are less distortive than those on personal and corporate income. And as a council, we had advocated for water charging, and the decision not to go ahead with that is a good example of where we take away another type of tax that is not transitory and rely on ones that are potentially more transitory. So following years of fiscal retrenchment and a general reduction in living standards, it's understandable that people want to see some payback. The summer economic statement sets out that 1.2 billion in spending is available for next year, consistent with achieving a balanced budget. Taking into account the costs of measures introduced last year, though, In the absence of additional revenue-raising measures, taxes in other words, that leaves around 500 million euros for new measures, and 300 million of this amount is available for new expenditure increases. So that's what's available, which when added to the pre-committed spending will bring the overall expenditure increase to 2 billion euros. That means that overall public spending will be around 60 billion euros next year. The challenge for Ireland is to maintain a sound budgetary position while simultaneously increasing capital investment to enhance competitiveness and support enterprise. So I welcome the commitment set out in last week's statement that the government is prioritising investment in order to address infrastructure gaps that have emerged in areas such as housing. Developing our infrastructure base while complying with the EU fiscal rules is a fundamental challenge. And another concern is that following a sharp drop during the recession, it looks good that private investment activity in Ireland has increased significantly. Irish private investment at 21% exceeds the Euro average at 17%. This is private investment, and the level seen in the UK. But you have to note that the private sector investment data for Ireland is influenced by a substantial increase in what is known as intangible investment, mainly attributable to the bringing onshore by the multinationals of intellectual property assets. So the question really arises, is that going to be an ongoing phenomenon? Can we rely on that income source? Or are we concerned that that might be a temporary phenomenon? Moreover, then, public investment on the public side at 2%, as a proportion of gross fixed capital formation at 2%, is below both the UK and Euro averages, and the level of investment projected over the medium term represents a significant challenge given our demographic pressures, the EU budgetary commitments, and yet we have all these deficits in telecommunication, innovation, transport and water infrastructure. So there's a third element of sustainable fiscal policy, the third element I mentioned. Funds are scarce, investment alone is no guarantee of success. It depends critically on how we use the money and that it's used efficiently. And that requires methodologies to identify projects and programs with the most favourable benefit-cost ratios. But it's critical that we ensure that appropriate value for money exercises are undertaken at the national planning stage. So when we decide overall where we're going to spend this small amount of money that we have and the large amount of money overall that we spend, that we actually assess it in terms of national need. And what tends to happen is the cost benefits are done at the project phase. So it's already gone down to a particular area of spending before that is carried out. So there must be better national planning in that regard. And in terms of infrastructure planning, Ireland has a very fragmented institutional framework. The IMF compared the value of public capital and measures of infrastructure coverage and quality, and it suggests improvement in investment management could significantly enhance the efficiency and productivity of public investment. There needs to be more coherence across government departments, agencies and local authorities if spending is to be more efficient. In conclusion, Ireland's ability to sell its goods and services abroad determines our living standards, employment levels, and our ability to finance public services. Ireland lost approximately 30% of its competitiveness during the period of the credit bubble in the run-up to the crash. It regained about 20% in the aftermath of the crisis. We're now ranked the 6th most competitive economy in the world, according to some indices. And that's a considerable achievement, and we should be really I suppose we should be glad and appreciate the sacrifices that were made by the whole population to achieve that. But the concern is that the vast majority of this improvement has resulted from prices being forced down by the crash, and then external factors that we had no control over, the low value of the euro, low interest rates and low energy prices. Moreover, when the recovery came, the record level of investment in advance of the crash has allowed the economy to expand rapidly without consequent increases in prices in most areas. But things are changing dramatically. Our growth prospects overall are still very good, but prices are rising, most particularly the price of accommodation. The external winds are against us, most particularly Brexit. Some of our public services are not performing, most particularly the health service, which without reform will surely continue to balloon in cost as the population ages. In regard to our enterprises, our productivity performance is excellent in the multinational sector, but very average in the rest of the economy. Our export performance has been driven by a narrow range of sectors and companies. As I said earlier, levels of private investment are exaggerated by multinational activities, and our public capital investment is lower than that of our competitors, whose economies are growing at much slower pace. All of this threatens our competitiveness and presents risks for our macroeconomic position. Therefore, the question arises as to whether Ireland's current economic model will work in the medium term. Does this work, this high growth rate? It seems inevitable that without expanding our capacity to grow through appropriate investment, without ensuring competitive public services, and without closing the considerable productivity gap between domestic and multinational enterprises, Ireland is very vulnerable. If we refuse to learn from the lessons of the past, if we do not seize the opportunity to put in place more solid foundations for growth, we are undermining Ireland's competitiveness and putting at risk our entire future prosperity. In terms of government spending plans, my personal view is that spending on capital must take priority, as raising current spending raises the risk of increasing prices across the economy unless there's sufficient capacity to soak up that extra demand. The dividends from capital investment take time to bear fruit, but are absolutely necessary to secure future jobs, wages, and the quality of our public services. However, the political system is understandably short-termist. We can't just blame politicians because the public, in many cases, is short-termist. We've learned to our cost the results of failing to consider fully the future consequences of actions or lack of actions. We must not do that again. So courageous decisions are required to be taken today to secure a sustainable, prosperous tomorrow. Thank you very much.